My name is Silas. I am 32 years old, and I was a free man who was stolen. Not kidnapped in the dark of an alley, stolen in broad daylight, off the streets of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, by men with papers that said I belonged to someone else. Men who looked me in the eye and smiled while they chained my wrists. I was a carpenter. I knew the weight of oak, the smell of fresh cedar, the way walnut grain runs deep and honest. But none of that mattered in Natchez, Mississippi, in the summer of 1858. What mattered was the color of my skin. And on that plantation, under that merciless sun, I became property. But I need to tell you something. What happened to me inside that place, inside that cabin on the edge of the forest, is something I have never fully spoken aloud. Until now. Before I tell you what happened inside that cabin, I need to ask you something. Because this story, the one I am about to finish telling you, sat inside my chest for years before I found the words for it. And I know that some of you watching right now have carried something similar. A weight that no one around you could see. A cage that had no visible bars. If that means something to you, if you have ever felt owned by a life you did not choose, please tell me where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments right now. Just your city, your state, your country. That small thing matters more than you know. And if you want to stay with me until the end of this story, because I promise you, what happened in that cabin will surprise you. Press subscribe. It is free, and for my family, it means everything. It is how we keep the lights on. It is how my children eat. Now, let me take you back to Mississippi, because the worst and the most extraordinary part is still ahead. There's a part of this story that will surprise you, not because it is impossible, but because it is true. I was a slave who was ordered to live beside the master's daughter, a woman who could not walk, a woman who hated herself almost as much as her father hated me. And somewhere in that strange, cruel arrangement, somewhere between the silence and the storms and the whispered pages of books read by candlelight, something neither of us expected began to grow. I want you to stay with me, because what happened next changed everything I believed about freedom, about love, and about what it truly means to be a human being. If this story is already touching something inside you, something old and real, please tell me where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it helps my family put food on the table. Now, let me take you back to Mississippi. Natchez in August smells like wet earth and rot and something sweet that almost tricks you into forgetting where you are. The plantation stretched out like a wound across the land. Rows of cotton so white they hurt your eyes in the afternoon sun. And beyond them, the dark line of the forest, thick and humid and full of sounds that never stopped. The cabin they gave me sat at the edge of that forest, half swallowed by Spanish moss that hung from the oak trees like the gray hair of old ghosts. The wood of the walls had warped from years of Mississippi rain. At night, the heat pressed down on everything like a hand that refused to lift. Fireflies blinked in the dark outside my one small window. They were the only beautiful thing about that place. I would lie on my cot and watch them and try to remember what Philadelphia felt like. The cobblestones, the cold wind off the Delaware River, the smell of my mother's kitchen. Every morning began before the sun. I rose in the dark, washed my face with water from a clay bowl, and walked the path to the main house to receive my orders from the overseer, a thin, pale man named Cutter, who wore his cruelty like a clean shirt, pressed and deliberate. My hands were valuable. That was the only reason I was treated with something that almost resembled care. A carpenter who could not use his hands was worthless, and worthless things got sold downriver. So Cutter watched me, but he did not break me, not with the whip anyway. My days were filled with sawdust and sweat, building furniture for men who would never know my name. I shaped dining tables for their Sunday meals, bed frames for their children, rocking chairs for their porches. Every piece I made was signed with silence. Every nail I drove was a small act of endurance. I told myself that as long as my hands were working, some part of me was still free. But the wound I carried was not in my back. It was in my memory. I had a mother in Philadelphia, a woman named Ruth, who took in sewing and sang hymns on Sunday mornings with a voice that made the whole street go quiet. I was taken 3 blocks from her front door. 3 blocks. I never got to say goodbye. For years I dreamed of her face, of the way she pressed her palm flat against my chest whenever she wanted me to be still and listen. I used to wonder if she thought I had abandoned her, if she had given up searching. In Natchez, grief was not permitted. You were not allowed to mourn what had been taken from you, because to mourn it was to admit it had value, and they needed you to believe that nothing you had before the chains was worth remembering. That was perhaps the cruelest part of all. Not the labor, not the heat, the forgetting they demanded of you. It was a Tuesday night when everything changed. I remember because Cutter had made us work through Monday without rest, and my body felt like wrung cloth. The colonel's houseboy came to my cabin after supper, his eyes low and nervous, and told me the colonel wanted me at the main house immediately. I had never been called to the big house at night. Nothing good ever came from that walk after dark. Colonel Sterling was sitting in his study with a glass of bourbon that was clearly not his first. His face was red and swollen with a particular kind of rage I had learned to recognize in men like him. The rage of a proud man who has been humiliated and needs somewhere to put it. On the desk in front of him was a letter. I could not read it then, but I would later learn it was a rejection. The 3rd gentleman that season to decline an offer to court his daughter, Isabella. The colonel looked at me like I was a nail he needed to hammer into something. He spoke slowly, the way drunk men do when they want to sound deliberate. He told me I was being reassigned. No more furniture, no more workshop. I was to move my belongings to the isolated cabin near the forest's edge, the one further out, past the oak grove, and from that day forward, my sole responsibility was his daughter. I would carry her, feed her, keep her company, and ensure she did not harm herself in one of her darker moods. He said it without looking at me, just stared at the letter on his desk. I stood very still. In my chest, something cold moved through me. Not fear exactly, but the particular dread of a man who realizes he has just been handed a punishment disguised as a duty. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to say 100 things. Instead, I said the only word a man in my position was permitted to say. Yes, sir. And I walked back out into the Mississippi night, with my life rearranged by a drunk man's wounded pride. The next morning I moved my few belongings, a blanket, a small carving knife, 2 pieces of cedar I had been saving, to the outer cabin. When I first saw Isabella, she was seated at the window in her European chair, wrapped in a pale blue robe, staring at the tree line as if she were watching for something that would never arrive. She was younger than I expected, maybe 22 or 23. Her hair was dark and loose around her shoulders. When she heard me enter, she turned and looked at me with eyes that carried an exhaustion far older than her face. She did not speak. Neither did I. I set my things in the corner room and began preparing her breakfast in silence. I placed the tray beside her without ceremony. She looked at the food, then looked at me, and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she had not asked for any of this either. Those were her first words to me, and somehow, in that small, broken sentence, I heard the echo of my own. The first opposition did not come from Isabella. It came from the other enslaved people on the plantation. Word spread quickly, the way it always does when you live in a place where information is the only currency no one can take from you. Some of them looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. An older woman named B, who had worked the colonel's kitchen for 30 years, stopped me on the path one morning and grabbed my arm with a grip that surprised me. She looked straight into my eyes and said, "Keep your head down and your heart closed in that cabin, Silas. Whatever you think you see in that girl, it will cost you everything." I thanked her and kept walking, but her words settled into me like a splinter, small, invisible, and impossible to ignore. I understood what she meant. I had seen what happened to men who forgot the distance that was supposed to exist between their world and the world of the main house. That distance was not just social. It was a matter of survival. At night, alone in my small corner of the outer cabin, I began to carve again. It was the only way I knew to quiet the noise inside my head. I worked by the light of a single tallow candle, shaping small figures from the cedar pieces I had saved. A bird with its wings half open, a pair of hands pressed together, a tree with roots that curled around the base like fingers holding on. Carving had always been the place where I could think without the weight of being watched. And in those quiet hours, I began to ask myself questions I had long stopped permitting. Who was I becoming in this place? Was the man who had been taken from Philadelphia still inside me somewhere? Or had Natchez slowly replaced him with something hollowed out and obedient? I was afraid of the answer. More afraid, perhaps, than I had been of anything since the night the bounty hunters put the chains on me. Because a man who does not know who he is can be made into anything. Then came the afternoon that shifted everything again. I had built Isabella a small reading support from leftover oak, a tilted frame she could rest a book against without needing to hold it. I left it beside her chair without explanation. When I returned an hour later with her afternoon tea, she was using it. She did not thank me, but she looked up from the page with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Something unguarded, almost startled, like a person who has just realized they have been holding their breath for years. That evening, Cutter appeared at the cabin door unannounced. He looked around the room slowly, his eyes moving over the reading support, the small ramps I had begun carving into the doorway thresholds so her chair could move more freely. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he told me the colonel had been informed of my modifications, that I had made changes to the property without authorization. He smiled when he said it. That smile told me everything. Someone was watching, and they were looking for a reason. 3 days later, I was called before the colonel again, this time in daylight, in front of the other field hands. He stood on the porch of the main house with Cutter beside him and accused me of overstepping, of acting as though I had authority I did not possess. The words were calm, but the intention was clear. This was a warning delivered publicly so that everyone would see it land. I stood in the dirt with the sun at my back and kept my eyes forward and my hands loose at my sides. Inside, something was burning. Not anger. I had learned long ago that anger was a luxury I could not afford. It was something quieter and more dangerous than anger. It was the recognition that no matter what I built, no matter how carefully I moved through that world, I was always one man's mood away from destruction. The colonel dismissed me with a wave. I walked back to the cabin. Isabella had heard everything through the open window. When I came through the door, her face was white and still, and she would not look at me for the rest of the day. That night was the longest I had spent since arriving at Natchez. I sat outside on the cabin step in the dark, listening to the forest breathe around me, and I felt something I had been fighting for years rise up through my chest without permission. It was grief, pure and old and enormous. I grieved for my mother. I grieved for the workshop I had owned in Philadelphia, small as it was, where I had swept my own floor and chosen my own hours. I grieved for the version of myself that had believed the world contained justice somewhere inside it. I pressed my back against the cabin wall and looked up at the sky through the oak branches, and I thought, if I disappeared into that forest tonight, if I simply walked and kept walking north, what would I lose? And then, before I could stop it, the answer came. Not a list of consequences, just one image. Isabella, alone at her window, with no reading support, no ramps, no one who had ever looked at her and seen something worth building for. I sat with that image for a long time. Then I went back inside. The revelation came on a wet October evening, when the rain was hitting the cabin roof like 1,000 small accusations. Isabella had asked me to retrieve a box from the top shelf of her wardrobe, a plain cedar box, nothing remarkable about it from the outside. When I lifted it down, the latch gave way, and the contents spilled across the floor. Letters, dozens of them, tied in bundles with faded ribbon. I began gathering them without looking, but one envelope stopped me cold. It was addressed in handwriting I did not recognize, but the name on the return was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the date was 1855, 3 years after I had been taken. I looked at Isabella. She had gone very still. Her eyes were on the letters, and her face had lost all its color. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear it, she told me that her father had not always been the man I knew, that there had been a time, before her illness, before her mother's death, when he had conducted business in the North, in Philadelphia. She reached down and took one of the letters from my hand. She unfolded it slowly, as though she had done it many times before, and she read me a single passage. It was a business correspondence between Colonel Sterling and a man named Hargrove, a bounty hunter operating out of Pennsylvania. The letter referenced the acquisition of a skilled carpenter, age 20, apprehended near the waterfront district. Acquired legally, it said, under the Fugitive Slave Act. Documented and delivered. I stood in the middle of that cabin floor with the rain coming down outside, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. Not physically, but in the way that truth shifts everything when it finally arrives in full. The Colonel had not simply purchased me at auction the way he claimed. He had ordered me, specifically. Someone had watched me work in Philadelphia, had noted my skills, had reported back. I had not been randomly stolen. I had been chosen. And the man who chose me was the same man who had, without knowing it, placed me in that cabin beside his daughter. The cruelty of it was so complete, it almost took my breath away. I stood there for a long time after Isabella finished reading. The letters were still scattered across the floor between us, like the pieces of something that could never be reassembled. And then, the weight of the choice I was facing settled onto my shoulders with a clarity that was almost unbearable. I could take those letters. I could find a way to get them to the right hands. Abolitionists, newspaper men, free black communities in the North who were documenting exactly these kinds of crimes. The letters were evidence, real, dated, signed evidence that Colonel Sterling had specifically ordered the kidnapping of a free man. It could mean my freedom. It could mean justice, the kind of justice I had stopped believing existed anywhere in this country. But it would also mean exposing Isabella. It would mean destroying whatever fragile piece she had constructed inside that cabin, inside herself. It would mean dragging her into a storm she had not chosen. And there was something else, something I had not yet allowed myself to name directly. I did not want to leave her. I made my decision slowly, the way you make decisions that you know will define you. Not in a single moment of courage, but across many small moments of honesty. I did not take the letters to anyone, not yet. Instead, I sat down across from Isabella, on the floor of that cabin in the rain, and I told her the truth about who I was. Not the carpenter, not the slave. Silas, the son of Ruth, born free on Lombard Street in Philadelphia. A man who had spent 4 years being slowly unmade by a system designed to convince him he was nothing. I told her about my mother's hands, about the smell of cedar in my first workshop, about the night the bounty hunters came. I talked for a long time, and she listened, really listened, in the way that very few people had ever listened to me in my entire life. When I finished, she reached across the space between us and placed her hand over mine, not with pity, with recognition. And I understood then what we actually were to each other. Not master and slave, not charity and burden. Two people who had been broken by the same man and had somehow, without intending to, begun to put each other back together. The confrontation came 6 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the plantation was quiet, and the colonel had been drinking since before church. Someone had talked. I never learned who, though I always suspected Cutter had seen more through that cabin window than he had ever let on. The colonel came down the path to the outer cabin himself, which was something he had never done before. I heard his boots on the gravel before I saw him. Isabella heard them too. She straightened in her chair and lifted her chin in a way I had come to recognize. It was the gesture she made when she was afraid, but had decided not to show it. The colonel pushed through the door without knocking and stood in the center of the room, looking at the two of us with eyes that were trying to confirm what someone had already told him. The reading supports. The books open between us on the table. The way we occupied that space together, not as master's daughter and assigned servant, but as two people who had built something real inside those four walls. He looked at his daughter. Then he looked at me. And the silence that followed was the most dangerous silence I had ever stood inside. Isabella spoke before he could. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead or apologize or shrink into the chair the way I had seen her do 100 times in the presence of her father's anger. She told him clearly, in the steady voice of a woman who had finally found solid ground beneath her, that she was carrying a child, that the child was mine, and that she would not be hidden, sold off, or silenced. The colonel's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, then fury, then something I had not expected to see there. Something that looked, beneath all the rage, like an old and exhausted shame. He raised his hand once, and I stepped forward, not threateningly, but enough. Enough to place myself between him and Isabella without a word. We looked at each other across that small cabin, the colonel and I, and something passed between us that I cannot fully explain even now. He was seeing me, perhaps for the first time, as a man, not property, not a tool, a man who loved his daughter and would not move. He lowered his hand, he turned, and he walked back up the path toward the main house without another word. We did not sleep that night. We waited, but the overseer never came. They say freedom is something you celebrate, but when the colonel's lawyer arrived 3 weeks later with my manumission papers, I did not feel like celebrating. I felt like a man standing at the edge of a river he had nearly drowned in, looking back at the water with something that was equal parts gratitude and grief. We left Natchez on a gray November morning, Isabella and I, with our few belongings loaded onto a modest wagon the colonel had arranged, without ceremony or farewell. He did not come out to see us go. I have thought about that many times over the years, whether it was cowardice or shame or something closer to mercy. I have decided it does not matter. What matters is this. Our daughter Hope was born the following spring in Pennsylvania, in a house I built with my own hands, on land where no man owned my hours. Isabella runs a school now for children the world has decided are inconvenient, and I still work with wood every single day. But now I sign my name to every contract. Now I choose every piece of timber. Sometimes, early in the morning before the rest of the house wakes, I sit on the porch and press my palm flat against my own chest, the way my mother Ruth used to do, and I listen. And what I hear is not silence. It is the sound of a life that belongs, fully and finally, to me. If this story reached something inside you today, something true and old and human, please share it. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, because these stories deserve to be heard, and every time you do, you help keep them alive.